start. Hello and welcome to Perspective. Now, this past week, China's military approved sending troops to Sansha in the disputed South China Sea territories. Now, the resource-rich area has been in the spotlight because of competing territorial claims from China, Taiwan, Vietnam, Philippines and two other ASEAN nations, Brunei and Malaysia. Just 2 weeks prior, ASEAN made history. A meeting of its foreign ministers failed to issue a joint communique for the first time in 45 years. This failure was due to Chair Cambodia refusing to allow Vietnam and Philippines to include language on the South China Sea in the joint communique. Now, what is really behind this failure and what does this spell for ASEAN? Can it still hold together and remain relevant? Joining me this evening are Professor Tommy Koh, Ambassador at Large at Singapore's Foreign Affairs Ministry, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Dean of the LKY School of Public Policy, Ambassador Barry Desker, Dean of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and Ms. Mothusa, Lead Researcher of the ASEAN Studies Center at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. Now, welcome all of you to the program. Thank you for joining us. Kishore, let me start with you. You called this failure at the ASEAN meeting a disaster. Now, why did you call it a disaster?
Well, it's pretty obvious when ASEAN's been meeting for 45 years and for the first time fails to produce a joint communique. That's a disaster. But ironically, I actually welcome this disaster because I think ASEAN was getting very complacent about its successes year after year. It's like a hurdler jumping over hurdles effortlessly. And you don't realize that there are hurdles out there you've got to jump over. And now, clearly, what this disaster has shown is that a new geopolitical contest is emerging in Southeast Asia between the United States and China, with both sides being pulled in different directions. So it's very clear that for ASEAN to maintain the same kind of unity that it maintained over the past 45 years, it's got to work much harder because the pulls that will be coming will be much stronger. And this is the kind of wake-up call that ASEAN needed at this point in time.
Do you agree, Professor Koh?
I wouldn't call it a disaster, but it's a serious setback for ASEAN credibility. And I say it's a teachable moment. I've asked myself, what lessons have I learned from this setback? And I would like to share with my colleagues and you 3 lessons. Lesson number 1, it is in the interest of every ASEAN member state to maintain ASEAN as a united and strong organization. A weak and disunited ASEAN serves nobody's interest. And I think when our leaders meet in November in Phnom Penh, I hope they will reaffirm this shared commitment. The second lesson is that all of us in ASEAN, all 10 of us, serve 2 sets of interests, our national interest and ASEAN regional interest. And I think when this is true of all countries, and our first foreign minister, Mr. Rajaratnam, said this in a seminal speech he made 45 years ago in August 1967. But this is especially true when an ASEAN country assumes a chair. When you assume a chair, as Cambodia has done, you must not only serve your national interest, but also serve ASEAN's interest, the regional interest. And I think what happened in Phnom Penh was a disappointment to the members of ASEAN because the chair lost focus of its ASEAN responsibility, which is to forge a consensus among all 10 countries. And my third lesson is a lesson for China, the United States, and other major powers. I would make the point that it is not in China's interest or America's interest to divide ASEAN and to make it a weak organization.
Ambassador Barry, do you think China has managed to divide ASEAN?
Well, I think that it's not a question of China trying to divide ASEAN. But if you're a great power, what you would like to do is to ensure that your will is executed. And as far as the Phnom Penh meeting was concerned, China's will was executed by the host. I'd like to take up Kishore's point about a disaster. I would call it a major setback, but it probably isn't a disaster. But Kishore is right as far as referring to a complacency on the part of ASEAN, because I think we have been complacent as a result of successes over 45 years. However, as we move forward, 2013 we will have Brunei in the chair, 2014 Myanmar, 2015 Laos. As a consequence, I think that the ability of the chair to shape discussions may be affected, because China's capacity to influence the chair will be greater, particularly amongst countries which are on China's periphery and who depend on China for trade, investment and other relationships.
Do you agree, Mr. Hu, that it's the countries on China's periphery or newer ASEAN countries who might not share the same sense that Professor Koh was talking about, unity from 1967?
I come from a newer member country, so I was of course watching the events in Phnom Penh unfold with great interest, especially as Ambassador Deska has said, Myanmar is going to take up the ASEAN chair in 2014, which is in itself an important year. It is the year just before ASEAN announces the achievement of the ASEAN community in 2015. And of course, knowing a bit about the way the bilateral relations between Myanmar and China have been shaped over these years, for the observer, the informed observer, I believe there might be some cause for concern. But then knowing a bit about how Myanmar has dealt with this immediate big neighbor to the north, I believe, watching how events have unfolded in Phnom Penh, lessons are being drawn by the Myanmar delegation on the effectiveness of chairing, being an effective chair and not just running meetings or chairing for chairing's sake. So definitely there is one big takeaway that the 45th AMM disaster, to use Prof. Kishore's words, can be seen. And knowing also a bit about the commitment that the current administration in Myanmar has, the very important role that it accords to ASEAN in its conduct of foreign relations and policy, I think there is that sliver of hope that Myanmar will be watching the 45th AMM lessons and drawing the important necessities from it.
Let's talk about those lessons and the reaction post the meeting. Indonesian president had strong words, strong by ASEAN standards, that he was disappointed with developments. Singapore's foreign minister called it a severe dent on ASEAN's credibility. There was a lot of flurry in the action. The Indonesian foreign minister flew around to try to get consensus. What do you think ASEAN countries have learned, if anything, from this incident?
I think the process of learning is just beginning. First of all, I think we should really commend Indonesia and the Indonesian foreign minister for taking the initiative to try and retrieve the situation. That's a kind of diplomatic leadership that Southeast Asia needs, and Indonesia is providing it. But I think what the ASEAN countries need to do is to essentially take on board the fact that this is a completely different era from what the ASEAN had to handle in the past. Remember the Cold War, ASEAN was all on the same side, you know. When two great powers were struggling, ASEAN was on one side, Vietnam was on the other side. Now the problem is the big geopolitical contest in the world is between the world's #1 power, United States, the world's #2 power, China, and the ASEAN countries will quite naturally get divided by this. So the challenge for ASEAN is they should recognize that these divisions will come, and then you should try and understand how to manage these divisions. And to make the situation even more complicated, what the South China Sea incidents are demonstrating is that the kind of centralized decision-making that China used to make in the past is disappearing. In fact, there's a brilliant paper I read yesterday by the International Crisis Group, a group set up by Gareth Evans, which describes in detail how the foreign ministry is just one component in the Chinese decision-making processes, and some local organizations selling fishing boats, Coast Guard vessels, and the kind of centralized authority in China is breaking down. And so this means that if you have to deal with a different kind of China, ASEAN itself has got to learn to adapt. And my main concern is that the ASEAN countries are not spending enough time in candid discussions among each other on what went wrong and how do we ensure at the end of the day that ASEAN doesn't fall apart.
I think Kishore's raised a very important point. The strategic landscape has changed. And when our leaders meet in November, I hope that they will have very deep reflections among themselves on how ASEAN should position itself in this rivalry between the two great nations. And I hope they will come to the conclusion that ASEAN's role in all the regional institutions that we convene and chair will be in jeopardy if we are not united, if we are unable to act as one and speak with one voice. So no matter what our individual preferences are, whether we are pro-China, pro-US, but when we meet at 10, it is fundamental that we subordinate our national preferences and reinforce ASEAN unity, ASEAN non-alignment, and ASEAN independence. I think that's my basic point.
I think Tommy has taken a very optimistic view, and one which I would be glad to share. However, I think from a realist perspective, one has to be much more cautious, because I suspect that one's bilateral and individual national interests will probably triumph over one's concern for regional amity. And that, I think, is the problem that ASEAN will have to deal with in the years ahead.
Can I just quickly respond? I agree with your realist point of view, but I actually am hoping that at the end of the day, that there'll be, after the leadership transition in Beijing, by the way, nothing's going to happen between now and November. They're too busy on the leadership change in China. But after that, I'm actually reasonably optimistic that China will engage in fairly deep reflection on whether it's in China's national interest, I share your realist point of view, to have ASEAN united or to have ASEAN divided. And the key point I make in my article, Tommy, is that a divided ASEAN actually is bad for China because it opens the door for other geopolitical games to be played on China's doorstep.
And
so China should be working together to
and bad for America too, I would say.
Yeah. Okay, on that note, we have to go for a short break. When we come back, national or international, regional interests, stay with us. Thank you for staying with us on Perspectives. Now, Mo, just before the break, we were talking about whether or not individual countries can rise above their own interests to look at the wider ASEAN good. What do you think?
Well, I was going to jump in when Prof. Barry was talking about the realist point of view. I am a constructivist. But the
Who's
situation...
right, constructivist or realist?
Well, we're all pragmatists in the end, aren't we? And we have to be
very
realistic.
Asian,
We live in a pragmatic world, and ASEAN is nothing if not pragmatic.
Yes.
And I think that is that kind of pragmatism that I think will prevail. The lessons from Phnom Penh, from the 45th AMM, are such that the furore it has raised in the media and so on, and people are talking frankly. They may not be formal statements, but informally or in editorialized comments, a lot of observations and discussions are being put forward on the whys and wherefores of what happened and the implications for future chairmanships. And these are exactly the kind of, I think, to take on the Pollyanna hat, the silver lining that I like to see coming out of what has obviously tarnished ASEAN's image. Prof. Kishore mentioned something about it is not in China's interest to have a disunited ASEAN. And I think China will also be looking at the kind of image that the 45th AMM outcome has cast on how it deals with an important dialogue partner. ASEAN is China's dialogue partner. China is ASEAN's dialogue partner. So for a dialogue partner relationship to continue on the even keel that it has, a lot of lessons will be taken from this. And I think that is why the views and opinions expressed on the outcome of the 45th AMM will not be lost either on future chairs or on big partner like China itself. So
Well, let's
that's
talk
the
about the
construct.
South China Sea issue itself, the whole issue which sparked this off, because this is a potential hotspot. It's always been a potential hotspot with competing ASEAN countries claiming. What has changed in the last year that this has suddenly become, but this has become much more intense, resulting in basically the failure of the last meeting?
I think tensions have been rising
Yes.
for the past year.
Yes.
Accompanying this, there's a rise of nationalism in China, in the Philippines, and in Vietnam. The rise of nationalism will constrain the freedom of action of the three countries. I think in Beijing there's a perception that the United States is stirring the waters and encouraging the Philippines and Vietnam in some of their recent actions. There's a certain game of tit for tat going on between Philippines and China and between Vietnam and China. And I would also agree with Kishore's point that this is a very sensitive year for both China and the United States. There's an important leadership transition taking place probably in October, and China cannot afford to look weak, to be making unilateral concessions. It is also a very sensitive year for America, because there will be a presidential election, and President Obama cannot afford to look weak and vulnerable to attack by his opponent on the ground that is allowing their Asian ally, the Philippines, to be bullied by China. So it's a difficult year for all the parties. As a non-claimant state, I would urge everybody to be calm and de-escalate, to stop provoking each other with actions such as you referred to and others.
I would also stress that action by China was taken on the very day that the six-point proposal came out. So how does it look, since China undoubtedly was aware that such a move was in train?
I think the issuance of the ASEAN statement of six principles was not provocative, because the Chinese have actually come out with a statement that the six principles are in consonance with China's own principles. You know, so I think the principles.
Yeah, it's not provocative, but I think some, particularly other claimant states, might have seen the Chinese action as a response to the ASEAN move.
I think it's driven, by the way, Tommy, I think I agree with you that it's driven by the fact that the leadership transitions in China and the United States. But they only illustrate a deeper problem. And here, frankly, there is a remarkable coincidence that the South China Sea issue, which was there, always a problem, always a flashpoint, but suddenly flashed up when the US-China rivalry rose. And I'll never forget the day when Barry Desker, at the Shangri-La Dialogue, asked Robert Gates stood up and said, hey, China should abide by the law of the sea convention in South China Sea. And Barry Desker said, Secretary Gates, when is the United States going to ratify the law of the sea convention? Now, that in itself, see, the fact that a country that hasn't itself ratified the law of the sea convention is asking China to abide by it is ultimate hypocrisy. But this brings me to my most essential point, Tommy. You know, if you look around the world, what's unique about Singapore is that even though we are a non-claimant state, we have on this tiny island state three of the best international lawyers in Singapore. Professor Tommy Koh, Professor Jayakumar, Professor Robert Beckman. Frankly, I think the three of you can work out a case to solve this problem on the basis of international law. So, Tommy, it's all in your hands.
As you were mentioning, Tommy, Kishore and I only highlight the problems. You bring the solution.
But I think that you cannot isolate the legal questions from the political. And I think that they are all bundled together. It's not easy for us to
But you can bring up the legal side.
No, I agree.
You see, for example, Tommy, to put it very simply, the 9 dotted line, dash line, is really untenable under international law. So, but you need distinguished international lawyers to tell China systematically, methodically, that yes, this may be based on historical claims, but once China ratified the law of the Sea Convention, it also undertook that all historical claims were surpassed by the law of the Sea Convention. Now, this is a very simple point that very few international lawyers have made directly to China. You can do it.
I think many of us have. And by the way,
No, but I think
Kishore turned out to be a very good international lawyer.
Kind of being the devil's advocate
Yeah.
here.
No, I think that's
Would,
sure.
and I'm sort of like thinking evil, as they say about, would China not then try to hide behind the declaration, the DOC,
Yes.
and then say, look, we haven't done anything about the code of conduct, and how about that? Because I believe, if I recall all my readings, and of course I'm being educated here, China has always tried to not bring this to the ASEAN table and or the ASEAN-China type of dialogue, but rather keep it bilateral. Whereas ASEAN has always maintained that, no, this is something that ASEAN dialogues with China, and we have 4 claimant states, and therefore for ASEAN, documents like the DOC and the COC are very important.
Yeah.
Actually, why is it?
I would say it's both bilateral and it's multilateral. It is true that the 6 of us who are not claimant state, we have not endorsed the claims of our 4 ASEAN brothers. And it would be a mistake if countries like Philippines and Vietnam were to automatically assume that we will support them against a Chinese claim.
Yes.
We don't. But it's a multilateral issue in that we want to maintain peace between China and Southeast Asia. And if there's conflict in Southeast Asia, peace will be jeopardized. This is why in 2002, ASEAN and China negotiated and agreed on the Declaration of Conduct of Parties. You know, this is why we are embarking on a new initiative to draft a code of conduct.
But the accusation is that it has not been
I would
effective.
highlight the fact that the DOC was agreed on in 2002.
Yes.
Incidentally, at Cambodia's chairmanship as well.
Yeah, but it's only in 2012 that we are talking about a code of conduct.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
isn't
that a
it
failure or
likely to be
success
that
of
the
us,
whole process is going to be dragged on? And as a result, events on the ground will actually shape developments.
But if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm mistaken, that China actually at one stage was reluctant to do the code of conduct.
That's right.
And recently China has shifted back to saying yes. Am I correct?
That is correct.
That is correct.
Why did China shift its position?
My assessment is because it thinks that ASEAN cannot get its act together.
This is
Maybe they were proven right.
No, I have a more benign experience. I think that China's original instinct was to say, no, we will not talk to ASEAN as a group. We want to talk individually to the 4 claimant countries. And the Chinese also say that, that we should not internationalize the issue. Therefore, it should not be discussed in forums like the ASEAN Regional Forum. But when time passed, the Chinese realized it's impossible to not talk about it in the ASEAN Regional Forum. And it's not possible to not talk about it when China meets with ASEAN as a group. And I thought China had also decided that the South China Sea should not be called a core interest of China. This is what the State Counsellor Tang Jiaxuan said in response to a question by Barry. But more recently, in Phnom Penh, I was surprised to read in a statement issued by the current Foreign Minister of China, Yang Jieqi, which refers to South China Sea as a core interest. So I don't know whether there's a rethinking on the part of China. And he also backtracked from an earlier commitment to join ASEAN in developing the Code of Conduct. He qualified China's position by saying that when the time is right, we will meet ASEAN.
But you know, the Chinese position is important to emphasize, is evolving. I was actually the Singapore SOM leader when we led the ASEAN SOM leaders to go to China, the fun of the early ASEAN-China dialogues in Hangzhou, I think. And since we could not put South China Sea on the table, on the agenda, all of us agreed, saying we have dinner, and after dinner we adjourned into a private room and we discussed South China Sea. And China was actually absolutely surprised at that meeting, that it wasn't just the claimant states in ASEAN who spoke about the South China Sea, but everyone did, and said this is an important issue for ASEAN. And I thought at that point in time we were close to convincing China that this is the one issue that they have to handle delicately.
We have to go for another short break. Sorry, we'll leave the South China Sea and come back to talk about Myanmar and whether or not ASEAN should claim any credit for its opening up. Thanks for staying with us on Perspectives. We're back and we're going to speak about Myanmar and whether or not ASEAN should claim any credit for the opening up. Mo, you would be the expert in the area. What do you think?
Well, Deborah, for me, I think the starting point for the slivers of, the winds of change to start happening, I would try to come back to 2008. And it's ironic. Sometimes it takes a tragedy or a disaster to bring out ASEAN's finest metal. So, and that was definitely the case for Myanmar.
Natural disaster in 2008.
Yes, 2008 Cyclone Nargis happened, and what was interesting was most of the ASEAN countries and the bilateral, the neighboring countries to Myanmar were sending aid, which was accepted without murmur, without anything. But it was when different members of the international community started offering not only emergency aid and supplies, but also their personnel and so on. That was when I think the military junta at the time became very reluctant, as it were, and there was a stalemate. And yet we had on our hands a humanitarian crisis looming, and it took ASEAN to step in and point blank ask Myanmar what ASEAN meant to the country. And surprisingly, Myanmar went with ASEAN. And why I say surprisingly is because in 2007 there was another disaster, another crisis, the Saffron Revolution, where Myanmar had made it clear that they preferred to somehow work through the UN process. And so come 2008 and Cyclone Nargis, Myanmar said, yes, we will accept international aid and assistance from every quarter, regardless of nationality or country. But it has to be coordinated through ASEAN. So for the first time, there was this mechanism for different interest groups to really come together. And I think that's why ASEAN triumphed, because the objective was so clear, is to help the people of Myanmar, especially the cyclone victims. And it has created this tripartite core group mechanism, which ASEAN, the UN, and the government of Myanmar were the key partners. And they met and threshed out all the necessities to facilitate aid and assistance to the Delta area where the cyclone victims were. Now, that tripartite core group mechanism itself has sort of had spin-offs. For some development assistance that Laos is negotiating with some of ASEAN's donor dialogue partners, they are looking at this kind of mechanism to really know what are the needs of the country, what the donor can provide, and what the international assistance agencies in the country, on the ground, can provide as a facilitating environment. So, yes, definitely, 2008 was the opening of eyes of many officials in Myanmar on how things could be done differently. And Mr. Thein Sein, who was Prime Minister at the time and President now, I think took that lesson very well.
Right.
So,
but do you think beyond the humanitarian front that any of the moves on the political front was prompted by the fact that ASEAN had been on Myanmar many years, and what do you
I think what happened in 2008, and you're absolutely right, it was a turning point. But it happened because Myanmar already had been a member of ASEAN for a long time. And in the course of 1,000 meetings a year, the Myanmar officials began to understand the ASEAN fabric, So and also I think in the course of traveling around ASEAN, they also could see the contrast between how fast the ASEAN countries were developing and how slow Myanmar was developing, and that helped to open their eyes. I say this because in the Western media, they've been crowing over the fact that Western sanctions opened up Myanmar, and that's rubbish. It's total rubbish, And the fact is, unfortunately, the ASEAN countries are so modest, they won't even try to claim credit for all these great things that are happening in Myanmar, the remarkable changes that are happening. And I think someone should write a case study on Myanmar and ASEAN and actually demonstrate. This actually proves the value of the 1,000 meetings that take place every year, which everyone dismisses as a talk shop, but it is not a talk shop.
It's ASEAN's demonstration effect. And, well, I was on the team preparing for Myanmar's admission to ASEAN. And then I remember those heady days. Definitely on the technocrat side, it was the only option. For a country under a repressive military junta, the demonstration effect of ASEAN, opening up through ASEAN, was the way to move towards this gradual transition to democratization and so on that was in the plan. So definitely learning how things are done and the comparison, as it were, has
socialization, if you would be.
Yes, Deborah, I think that's a very good definition, socialization. So yes, ultimately change happens from within. It has to take somebody in the administration to take that decision and move forward with it and keep to it. But what prompted that internal change was this demonstration effect of ASEAN.
I think we may give ourselves too much credit. I think
There's no such thing as too much credit.
change occurred because Myanmar leaders recognized that the country was falling behind. I mean, that said, I recognize that significant changes have been made. And coming from me, because I've been known as a critic of the government of Myanmar, and I've spoken out calling...
critic of Myanmar, ASEAN's admission of Myanmar.
Yes, and also calling for its suspension of Myanmar.
No, but I think that's not the issue. The issue that you posed to Mo is whether these internal changes were inspired by the example of ASEAN countries or as a result of pressure, isolation and sanctions by the West. And I frankly say we don't know what the answer is. Only the Myanmars can respond to your question. Mo has given us one. We shouldn't claim too much credit, but I like to believe that the ASEAN way of patient engagement, of not isolating a country and imposing sanctions on them, which only hurt the very people we want to help. But the demonstration effect is a better way.
Tommy, I agree we should not claim too much credit, but I think ASEAN is the most undersold organization in the entire world. When you consider, by the way, that the most unpromising region in the world to build a regional organization is Southeast Asia, is the Balkans of Asia, with far greater diversity of race, language, religion, literature and everything. And here in the midst of this inhospitable environment by any standards, you have the second most successful regional organization in the world. And you know what? The rest of the world doesn't know about it, no? So after I finish my next book, The Great Convergence, I'm going to write a book on Southeast Asia to make the case that this is the most blessed corner of the earth and we should celebrate ASEAN more.
Ambassador Bear, I think you might challenge. Let's talk about the ASEAN Way, which Professor Koh raised, right? Some people said the ASEAN Way to build consensus is actually the lowest common denominator approach. Instead of aiming
That's
for
my phrase, actually.
Which is why I'm throwing this back at you,
No, but it's not always... No, I'm sorry. I want to say it's not always the lowest common denominator. I spent a year of my life helping to draft the ASEAN Charter. In the beginning of this journey, I did not think we would arrive at a consensus to set up a Commission on Human Rights. Because only a minority of member states of ASEAN have in their own country national commissions of human rights.
Yes.
So in this case, the consensus was forged not on the basis of the lowest common denominator, but of the highest common denominator. So sometimes ASEAN surprises you.
But actually, Kishore and I were the Sherpas for the first ASEAN summit on the Singapore side. And that's when the term, the ASEAN Way, first came out. And it came about in the context of the lowest common denominator, when we were negotiating, and that was what we could all agree on. We called it the ASEAN Way.
Consensus building in a quiet way.
The ASEAN Way also is 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. That's okay. It's all right.
Do you agree?
It could also mean agreeing to disagree.
Yeah.
But then again, if you look at the ASEAN Way consensus consultation, I always go to the joint communiques. You really miss them when they're not around. Because a lot of people like to diss on the joint communiques. They always say that, again, Dean Barry, because of the lowest common denominator, the language in the joint communiques are always very bland, they don't tell a story and so on. But when you don't have a joint communique, then you realize, ASEAN is about all these important points that are raised in the joint communique that people are discussing and dialoguing on.
Yeah.
And then we realize what's reflected is actually the status of what's being done. Yes, it may be slow in the ASEAN dance, as you said, Prof. Kishore, but even the blandness of it, I think, is something that ASEAN can point to.
Yeah.
And
if I could bring this back to the South China Sea and what happened in Phnom Penh, I think that it was a mistake not to issue a joint communique. And I think the subsequent shuttle diplomacy of Pak Mati has shown that we are united around 6 core principles. And these 6 core principles could have been reflected in the joint communique as the common position of ASEAN country. We may not agree on specific disputes, and it's not for ASEAN to do that, but not to reflect in the joint communique our unified position on principles that should govern these disputes.
Let me engage you, Tommy. Aren't those 6 principles really motherhood statements?
Oh, but motherhood is very important. And one of the, I'm all for mothers, you know, but I want to make this important. But one of the important, I want to refer to 2 important motherhood principles. 1, non-use of force, and non-resort to the threat of use of force. I think this is absolutely fundamental. The second principle is strict adherence with international law, and especially the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. All claims in the South China Sea must be tested against international law and against the UN Convention. I think this is not unimportant. These motherhood principles have consequences.
All right, thank you very much. We'll go for the next break. When we come back, we'll pick up on human rights, ASEAN and human rights after the break. Thanks for staying with us on Perspectives. Now, let's talk about ASEAN and human rights. Ambassador Desker, could you put ASEAN and human rights in the same sentence and come out positive?
Well, I would say that, as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, ASEAN is an intergovernmental organization. Human rights, would play a role insofar as it is today a trendy issue, and there are people interested in raising it to the ASEAN level. However, if you look at the ASEAN Charter, the role of human rights is not the role which was given at the time that the Eminent Persons Group discussed the issue. It is now very much more conscribed. Moore is probably a lot more competent to discuss the extent to which the ASEAN governments decided to conscribe the role of ASEAN with regard to the field of human rights.
Well, do you agree with Professor Cole, so that early on when he talked about the Human Rights Declaration, that we're aiming for the highest level here, not the lowest common denominator for ASEAN?
No, what I mean is to arrive at a consensus,
yeah,
to set up the Commission on Human Rights, was an example of agreeing on the highest common denominator rather than lowest.
Well, that's true. And I think that's one of the plus points of ASEAN. It is always very aspirational. It has very high aspirations that, to give it credit, it does try to meet. So I think sometimes there's nothing wrong with having high ambitions, but of course, when you work it out, inevitably, even the Charter, Prof. Tommy, I wasn't at the Charter drafting process, but inevitably many of the provisions, of course, will be the result of compromise. And that is where I think national interest and domestic politics do come into play in this eternal two-level game. But having human rights, an ASEAN body on human rights, and not one but 2. We have the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, and we have a separate body on the promotion and protection of the rights of women and children. So ASEAN, in the Charter, it says we will establish an ASEAN human rights body and left it at that. But we've gone 2 steps further in that sense. And this is, I think, moving in the transition towards the people-centered ASEAN that the social cultural community in ASEAN is supposed to be all about. So yes, politically maybe human rights is not really there, and it's supposed to be something that national governments have national responsibilities to implement and follow through. But definitely, if you look at addressing the needs and concerns of the people, this is something that cuts across all communities.
Can I, if you don't mind, give, in contrast to Barry, a much more optimistic view on ASEAN and human rights? Okay, you can discuss on the one hand the legal stance taken by various ASEAN countries in human rights. That's one box of discussions. The other box of discussions is the actual practices and implementation of human rights in ASEAN societies, and by any standards. I mean, to take even the country that Dari Desker knows much better than I do, the transformation of Indonesia from the kind of, strongman military rule that General Suharto had until 1998. And today you go to Indonesia, it's one of the most vibrant democracies in the entire world, And how did this transformation take place so remarkably? So clearly there's some chemistry in the ASEAN region that is creating political transformations in the region. Malaysia decided to give up its ISA. Even Thailand, with all its political difficulties, if you go down there, the discussion is remarkably robust.
But would you credit ASEAN for these changes?
Of course.
Well, because of the ASEAN human rights move, sorry, Prof. Kishore, Myanmar went and established a National Commission on Human Rights. And now that would have been unthinkable as recent as 5 years ago.
See, Indonesia remains impatient with ASEAN positions on human rights.
That's true, which is good. I mean, it's good to have some members of ASEAN that want to push the envelope. And by the way, I want to emphasize one very important point here. The effects of ASEAN happen in the tangible sphere, and they also happen in the intangible sphere. Let me give you a wild example. Out of the blue, to everybody's surprise, ASEAN set up an open skies agreement. As a result of the open skies agreement, budget airlines are flying all over Southeast Asia. As a result of budget airlines flying all over Southeast Asia, poor artists who couldn't travel in Southeast Asia are now traveling across the borders. So you're getting artistic collaboration within Southeast Asian countries that didn't collaborate before because of budget flights. So these are the kind of intangible changes that ASEAN is creating that people don't give it enough credit for.
Well, I was going to ask earlier, or picking up from that point, that does ASEAN really matter to the peoples of ASEAN, or is it just a limited small community? You've kind of just answered the question, but is anybody else?
Yeah, I would say to the skeptics who have asked me, what has ASEAN achieved in the last 45 years? What impact has it made on the lives of our 600 million people? And I would say first, ASEAN has kept the peace in the region. Without peace, economic endeavor would have been very difficult. Second, ASEAN has progressively reduced barriers to all kinds of trans-border cooperation in trade, in investment, the mobility of talented human beings, businesses, civil society, artists, and so on. And third, by being united, by being relevant and useful to the major and great powers, ASEAN has become the convener and facilitator of Southeast Asia's relations with all our great external partners. It's a miraculous achievement. Who could have imagined?
I agree with everything Tommy has said. However, I think the point that we who are so involved in ASEAN often forget is that we are discussing amongst ourselves. These are tremendous achievements. But for the man in the street, there is little awareness of what has been achieved and how it affects his or her daily lives.
Is that true, Mo?
Well, it's a very interesting point that Prof. Barry brought up.
You're being very diplomatic.
No, because, you see, when I engage a lot of people, I think there was one expression that I used to Prof. Tommy to describe myself. I said I'm an ASEAN missionary. Because I do happen to believe in ASEAN and the process of bringing people together around a common and shared interest. Now, the problem, Prof. Barry, I think, the man on the street, if you go and ask him or her about what does ASEAN mean to you, chances are we'll get a blank stare, or we'll get questions like, can I travel freely? Of course, I'm talking in the context of my own country. Or can I live, work, play, and study in any country I want in the region? I think it boils down to that. But another interesting layer of discourse there is people tend to look towards ASEAN as a separate entity from ourselves. And you see this happening. A lot of us, we fall into this trap of saying ASEAN must do this, ASEAN must do that. But I think we all forget sometimes that we, the individuals, are all part of ASEAN, and therefore, for ASEAN to be internalized, I think it is the work of every individual to go and impact at least another individual. So that's my take on that.
Can I share with more my big ambition?
Of course.
My big ambition is to have something in ASEAN similar to the European Erasmus program, under which tens of thousands of European university students leave their home campus every year, cross the border, study at another university. The credit they earn there are portable back to their own country. I think this sense that we are ASEAN can only come about with the young people.
That's an interesting point,
we must be bold and visionary. Let us implement something similar to Erasmus.
But can I just say, by the way, just to balance what you said, I agree that Erasmus has worked well in Europe. But you must remember that contextually, ASEAN is different. We should do something similar to what the Europeans do, but we should never copy the Europeans, because they have the advantage of having a single mono civilization, which is not we don't have. And so transitions across borders here will take more time. By the end of the day, by the way, I want to emphasize one thing in response to Barry. From the point of view of the man of the street today, if you look at the number of ASEAN citizens crossing ASEAN borders, is the highest number it's ever been. Look at what our trade within ASEAN countries is the highest number it's ever been. You look at the sort of even connections among universities that you mentioned, it is also happening also. Yes. So I think at the end of the day, by a slow process, the man in the street is beginning to feel the impact of ASEAN.
Okay, right. And on that note, positively, we have to end the program. Thank you all for joining us. Now, all eyes will be on the ASEAN Leaders Summit in Phnom Penh in November to see if ASEAN leaders can hold together the organization, stay together and stay relevant. Keep writing and connecting with us by leaving your comments on our website, and you can also tweet us as well. Join us again on the first Sunday of September. Good night.